The amber light of dusk painted the Missouri grasslands in hues of gold and rust as Harlan Mackenzie stood on the weathered porch of his ranch house, clutching a bank notice that might as well have been his death warrant. The paper trembled in his calloused hands, not from the evening breeze that swept across the parched earth, but from the rage and despair coursing through his 55-year-old frame. 500 acres of land that had been in his family for 2 generations would be foreclosed at dawn. Every fence post, every water trough, every memory built into this soil would belong to the bank by sunrise. 48 hours, Harlan muttered, reading the words for the 100th time. 48 hours to settle a debt of $800 or lose everything. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had borrowed that money 3 years ago to purchase breeding cattle from a Kansas City rancher who'd promised the animals would transform his operation. Instead, they'd arrived sick, spreading disease through his herd. Then came the drought, 2 relentless years of merciless sun that turned his grasslands into a crackling brown wasteland. His cattle had died by the dozens, their carcasses picked clean by buzzards while he watched helplessly. The bank, once so eager to extend credit, had become as unforgiving as the drought itself. Harlan's wife Sarah had died 5 years earlier from consumption, leaving him to raise their only son, James, alone. But James, at 23, had caught gold fever and joined a wagon train heading west to California 3 months ago. The boy hadn't even said goodbye properly, just left a note on the kitchen table saying he couldn't watch his father lose everything slowly when fortune waited in the Sierra Nevada. Coward, Harlan had called him then. Now, in his darkest moment, he wondered if James had simply been smarter than his stubborn old man. The neighboring ranchers had been circling like vultures for weeks. Marcus Thornton, who owned the spread to the north, had already made an insulting offer, $200 for the entire property. "You're finished, Mackenzie," Thornton had sneered just yesterday at the general store. "A man your age should know when to quit. Sell what's left and go live with your sister in St. Louis. This land needs someone who can actually work it." The humiliation burned worse than the Missouri summer sun. Harlan had built his reputation on self-reliance and strength. He'd survived Indian raids, blizzards, and floods. He'd broken wild horses and faced down claim jumpers. To lose everything now, to be labeled a failure by men like Thornton, it was unbearable. As darkness settled over the grasslands, Harlan retreated inside his house. The interior was sparse and masculine. Sarah's gentle touches had faded over the years. He poured himself a whiskey, then another, staring at the dying embers in the fireplace. Tomorrow morning, bank representatives would arrive with the sheriff to oversee the property transfer. They'd inventory every last item, his saddles, his tools, even his late wife's china that he'd kept wrapped carefully in the sideboard. He thought about fighting. He had a rifle and knew how to use it. But what good would violence do? They'd just bring more men, and he'd end up in prison or dead. Neither option would save his land. Around midnight, Harlan heard a tentative knock at his door. He considered ignoring it. He wanted no witnesses to his despair, but the knocking persisted, gentle yet insistent. When he finally opened the door, he found Beatrice Hartwell standing on his porch, illuminated by the lantern she carried. His neighbor from the adjacent property had always been an enigma to Harlan. At 42 years old, Beatrice was a widow who managed her own small ranch alone after her husband Thomas had died from typhoid fever 4 years ago. Where Harlan's land stretched 500 acres, hers was a modest 80 acres, tucked against the eastern border of his property. Beatrice had a full, sturdy figure, the kind of build earned from years of hard physical labor. Harlan had to admit, though he never would allowed, that she managed her property with remarkable efficiency. But he'd never been kind to her. He'd mocked her to other ranchers, calling her that fat widow who thinks she can do a man's work. When her cattle had wandered onto his property last year, he'd driven them off rather than notifying her. He'd refused her requests to share water access during the worst of the drought. In his mind, a woman running a ranch was an affront to the natural order, especially a woman who didn't have the good sense to remarry and let a man take proper charge. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said curtly, "it's late. What do you want?" Beatrice's round face showed no offense at his rudeness. Her dark eyes, framed by premature gray streaks in her brown hair, held something Harlan couldn't quite identify. Not pity, but perhaps understanding. "I know what's happening tomorrow morning," she said quietly. "The whole territory knows. I've come to offer help." Harlan's jaw clenched. "I don't need charity from anyone, especially not from—" He stopped himself, but Beatrice finished the sentence for him. "Especially not from a fat widow who should know her place?" Her voice held no anger, only a weary acknowledgment of his prejudice. "I'm not here to offer charity, Mr. Mackenzie. I'm here to offer a business opportunity." Despite himself, Harlan's curiosity was piqued. "Business? Woman, I'm being foreclosed on at dawn. What business could possibly—" "May I come in?" Beatrice interrupted. "What I have to show you requires more than a conversation on your porch." Reluctantly, Harlan stepped aside. Beatrice entered, carrying not just her lantern, but also a worn leather satchel that looked like it had seen better days. She set both on his kitchen table and began unpacking items: a small cloth pouch that rattled with seeds, and a leather-bound journal so old its cover was cracked and faded. "This," Beatrice said, placing her hand on the journal, "belonged to my late husband, Thomas. Before we settled here, he spent 5 years in Spanish territory, Mexico, California, even down into areas where Spanish missionaries had established settlements. He was fascinated by how they managed agriculture in arid climates." Harlan stared at her. "Mrs. Hartwell, I appreciate whatever sentiment brought you here, but I fail to see how your husband's old journal—" "Have you noticed," Beatrice interrupted again, her voice gaining strength, "that my property has stayed green through both years of drought? That my cattle are healthy while yours died? That my yields have actually increased while everyone else's have failed?" Harlan had noticed. He'd attributed it to her smaller operation, or perhaps just dumb luck. "What's your point?" "My point," Beatrice said, opening the journal to pages filled with meticulous handwriting and detailed sketches, "is that Thomas brought back more than stories from Spanish territory. He brought back knowledge, specifically the knowledge of how to grow drought-resistant grasses and how to irrigate land when water is scarce." She pushed the journal toward Harlan. The pages showed diagrams of irrigation systems, notes on soil composition, and detailed descriptions of grass species that could survive in harsh conditions. There were calculations for water distribution and sketches of what appeared to be bamboo pipe systems. "Thomas learned about these grasses from mission priests in California," Beatrice continued. They're varieties originally from Spain, bred over centuries to survive in dry Mediterranean climates. Before he died, we planted them on my property. That's why my land has stayed productive. Harlan examined the journal more closely, his whiskey-fogged mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. "Why are you showing me this?" Beatrice opened the cloth pouch, revealing seeds, small, unremarkable to the untrained eye, but potentially invaluable if her story was true. "Because tomorrow morning you lose everything, but it doesn't have to be that way." "The bank wants $800 by dawn," Harlan said bitterly, "unless those seeds are made of gold." "I'm not offering to pay your debt," Beatrice said firmly. "I'm offering a partnership. You have 500 acres of land that could be productive again with the right approach. I have the knowledge and seeds to make that happen. We combine our resources, implement these techniques, and split the profits equally. 50-50. Harlan felt anger rising in his chest. "You want me to go into business with you? A woman? A woman who has succeeded where you have failed," Beatrice said, her voice hardening slightly. "You can let your pride destroy you completely, or you can set it aside for one moment and see the opportunity here." "This is absurd." Harlan stood pacing. "Even if I wanted to accept such a ridiculous proposal, the bank forecloses in—" He checked his pocket watch. 8 hours. There's no time to implement anything. They'll take the land regardless." Beatrice was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost sad. "I know. That's why I'm going to buy your property from the bank." Harlan froze. "What?" "I have $600 saved," Beatrice said. "It's everything I have. The money from selling my wedding jewelry. Every penny I've managed to save since Thomas died. It's not enough to pay off your full debt, but combined with the bank's eagerness to recoup something, I believe I can negotiate a sale. I'll purchase 80% of your property. You'll retain 20% ownership and continue to live here, managing the daily operations. We'll implement the irrigation and planting techniques together, and when the property becomes profitable again, we'll split the proceeds equally." The room seemed to spin. Harlan gripped the back of his chair. You're going to buy my ranch out from under me?" "I'm going to save it," Beatrice corrected, "and save you in the process, though I suspect that distinction doesn't matter much to your pride." "My pride?" Harlan's voice rose. "You're damn right my pride matters. I built this ranch with my own hands. My father worked this land before me. And you want me to accept being reduced to what? A hired hand on my own property? Taking orders from a woman?" "No," Beatrice said, standing to face him. "I want you to accept being a partner, an equal partner in a venture that benefits us both. But if you'd rather lose everything tomorrow just to preserve your pride, then I'll leave now, and you can face the dawn alone." She began gathering her things, but Harlan caught her wrist. His grip was gentle, but his voice was desperate. "Wait." They stood there in the lamplight, two people scarred by loss and hardship, facing an impossible decision. Harlan felt everything he'd believed about himself crumbling. To accept her offer felt like admitting he was weak, admitting that a woman was more capable than he was, admitting that his entire world view had been wrong. But the alternative was losing everything. "Why?" he finally asked. "Why would you risk everything you have to help me? I've been nothing but cruel to you." Beatrice pulled her wrist free but didn't move away. because I know what it's like to lose everything and feel helpless. Because, despite your cruelty, I see a man who loves his land and worked hard for it. And because," she paused, "because this drought will kill everyone in this territory if we don't start sharing knowledge instead of hoarding pride. If we can prove these techniques work on a large scale, we can help others. We can save this entire region." Harlan sank back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. Everything in him wanted to refuse, to rage against the humiliation of accepting help from someone he'd dismissed and mocked. But dawn was coming, and with it, the loss of everything his family had built. "I need time to think," he said weakly. "You have until the bank arrives," Beatrice replied, leaving her journal and seeds on the table. "I'll be at my property. If you decide to accept, come find me before they get here. If not—" She trailed off, then added quietly, "I'm sorry, Harlan. I'm truly sorry it came to this." After she left, Harlan sat alone with the journal and seeds, his mind a storm of emotions. He read through Thomas Hartwell's notes, seeing the careful observations and innovative thinking that had kept Beatrice's property thriving. The irrigation system used bamboo pipes to deliver water directly to plant roots, minimizing evaporation. The drought-resistant grasses had deep root systems that could reach water far below the surface. The journal detailed crop rotation techniques and soil amendments that would restore fertility to exhausted land. It was brilliant. It was exactly what his property needed, and he'd been too blind and arrogant to see it. As the first gray light of dawn crept through his windows, Harlan made his decision. He couldn't let pride destroy what remained of his life. He grabbed his hat and walked across the grassland to Beatrice's property, finding her already awake and dressed, clearly prepared for whatever the day would bring. "I accept," he said simply. "I accept your partnership." Relief flooded Beatrice's face. "Then we need to move quickly. The bank representatives will arrive within the hour. I'll ride to meet them on the road and propose the sale before they reach your property. You stay here and start preparing. We'll need to begin work immediately if we're going to save the fall season." But when the bank representatives arrived, accompanied by Sheriff Morrison and Marcus Thornton, who'd clearly come to watch the spectacle, things didn't proceed as Beatrice had hoped. "Mrs. Hartwell," the bank agent, a thin man named Caldwell, said with barely concealed condescension, "while we appreciate your enthusiasm, the bank cannot sell Mr. Mackenzie's property to you." "Why not?" Beatrice demanded. "I have $600 in cash, and I'm willing to assume any remaining debt as part of the purchase." Caldwell exchanged glances with Thornton, who was smirking. "Because, Mrs. Hartwell, bank policy requires that property sales be made to qualified buyers. As a woman, you cannot purchase land without a husband's or male relative's signature. Even the property you currently own remains technically in your late husband's name." The words hit like a physical blow. Harlan, who'd been standing beside Beatrice, felt rage surge through him, not at her, but at the system that would deny her this opportunity despite her capability. "That's absurd," Harlan said. "She runs her property better than any man in this territory." "Nevertheless," Caldwell continued, "those are the rules. Now, Mr. Mackenzie, if you'll sign these papers—" "No," Harlan said. Everyone turned to stare at him. "I won't sign," Harlan continued, "not until you allow Mrs. Hartwell to purchase the property as she's proposed." Caldwell's face reddened. "Mr. Mackenzie, You don't have a choice. The sheriff is here to enforce the foreclosure. If you refuse to cooperate, then take it by force, Harlan said. But I'm telling everyone here right now that Beatrice Hartwell is the only reason my property has any value at all. She has the knowledge and means to restore this land. Selling it to anyone else is a mistake. Marcus Thornton laughed. The old fool's lost his mind. Sheriff, do your duty. But Sheriff Morrison, a fair man who'd known both Harlan and Beatrice for years, looked troubled. Hold on now. If Mrs. Hartwell can demonstrate she has the means and ability to restore the property, maybe there's a way to work this out. There's no way to work it out, Caldwell insisted. Bank policy is clear. Then what if I purchase the property? A new voice interrupted. Everyone turned to see James Mackenzie riding up on horseback, dusty from hard travel. Harlan's son dismounted, looking thinner and more weathered than when he'd left, but his eyes were clear and determined. James? Harlan couldn't believe it. What are you doing here? I thought you were in California. I made it as far as Independence, Missouri, James said, approaching the group. Then I heard about the foreclosure. I sold everything I had and rode straight back. He pulled a money pouch from his saddlebag. I have $300, not enough to save the ranch on my own, but he looked at Beatrice. I heard Mrs. Hartwell's offer from one of the hands in town. If the bank won't sell to her directly, they can sell to me, and I'll make her a full partner. My father will have his 20%, Mrs. Hartwell will have 40%, and I'll retain 40%. We'll work the land together using her methods. Caldwell looked frustrated, but he couldn't argue with this solution. That would be acceptable. With $900 between you and Mrs. Hartwell's $600, I only have $300, James interrupted. But Mrs. Hartwell has $600, which makes $900 total, more than enough to clear the debt and provide operating capital. The bank agent calculated quickly, realizing this was better than foreclosing on a property that might sit empty for months. Very well, I'll need all parties to sign the paperwork. Over the next hour, documents were drawn up and signed. Harlan watched in amazement as his property was legally saved through an alliance he never could have imagined. His wayward son and the neighbor he'd scorned working together to preserve his legacy. Marcus Thornton left in disgust, but not before muttering loudly enough for everyone to hear. Mark my words, this won't work. A woman, a boy, and a broken-down old fool trying to run a ranch? Give it 6 months, and they'll be begging to sell to someone competent. As soon as the official business concluded, Beatrice took charge. We start today, she announced. Every hour of daylight counts. James, can you ride to the lumber yard in town and purchase bamboo? They special order it from river traders. Tell them we need enough to create irrigation lines across the entire eastern pasture. Harlan, you and I will start surveying the land and marking where we'll dig the irrigation trenches. For the first time in years, Harlan felt something other than despair. He felt hope. The work was brutal. They spent 2 weeks digging trenches across the property, laying bamboo pipes that would carry water from the main well to different sections of the grassland. Beatrice supervised every detail, showing them exactly how the pipes should be positioned and connected. They worked from before sunrise until after sunset, all 3 of them collapsing exhausted each night. James proved himself more capable than Harlan had given him credit for. The boy had grown up during his brief time away, and he approached the work with genuine humility, deferring to Beatrice's expertise without the pride that had crippled his father. How did you learn all this? James asked one evening as they worked by lantern light to adjust a pipe connection. "From Thomas's journal, mostly," Beatrice replied, "but also from experimentation. The journal gave me the foundation, but I spent 2 years testing and adapting the techniques to our specific soil and climate. Failure teaches you more than success sometimes." "Mrs. Hartwell," Harlan said, wiping sweat from his brow, "I owe you an apology, a real one. I've been—" he struggled for words, "I've been a prejudiced, arrogant fool. You've shown more capability and generosity than I've ever demonstrated, and I'm ashamed of how I treated you." Beatrice was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Apology accepted. But Harlan, I need you to understand, I'm not doing this to prove anything to you or anyone else. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do, for all of us and for this land." Once the irrigation system was in place, they began planting. Beatrice carefully distributed the drought-resistant grass seeds, mixing them with native species in patterns she'd perfected on her own property. She explained that the Spanish grasses would stabilize the soil while the native plants provided additional nutrients and diversity. The whole territory watched with skepticism. Marcus Thornton made a point of riding past regularly, shouting mockeries. "How's that mud farming going, Mackenzie? Ready to admit defeat yet?" Other neighboring ranchers whispered that Harlan had lost his mind, letting a woman dictate how to run his property. Some suggested that Beatrice had used feminine wiles to manipulate both Mackenzie men into giving her control. The rumors grew increasingly crude and insulting. Beatrice ignored them all, focused entirely on the work. But one evening, about 6 weeks into the project, they faced a crisis. A section of the irrigation system had collapsed, and water was flooding uselessly into a ravine instead of reaching the planted areas. The grasses in that section were already showing signs of stress. "We need to dig up the entire line and relay it," Beatrice said, examining the damage. "It'll take at least 3 days of intensive work. If we don't get water to those grasses soon, they'll die, and we'll lose a quarter of our planting." They worked around the clock, taking shifts to sleep, while the others continued digging. James proved his worth during this crisis, working through his exhaustion and even recruiting some of his old friends to help. Several young men from the territory who'd known James before he left came to assist, partly out of loyalty to him, partly out of curiosity about Beatrice's methods. On the 3rd day, as they finally completed the repairs and water began flowing properly again, Marcus Thornton rode up with several other prominent ranchers. Harlan steeled himself for more mockery, but Thornton's expression wasn't triumphant. It was troubled. "Mackenzie," Thornton said, dismounting, "I need to ask you something. That grass you're growing, the green stuff that's already coming up in your fields, where did you get it?" Harlan glanced at Beatrice, who stepped forward. "It's a drought-resistant variety from Spanish territory." "Why do you ask?" Thornton looked uncomfortable, clearly unhappy about addressing a woman directly, but his desperation overcame his prejudice. "Because my herd is dying. The drought's killed everything on my property. I've lost 60% of my cattle in the last month alone. If I don't find a solution soon, I'll be in the same position Mackenzie was." Beatrice studied him for a moment, then said, "The grass alone won't save you. You need the irrigation system, too." The two worked together. "Will you—" Thornton struggled with the words. "Will you teach me? I'll pay whatever—" "I don't want payment," Beatrice interrupted, "but I want your respect. I want you to acknowledge publicly that a woman, this woman specifically, saved your ranch. Can you do that?" Thornton's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. The other ranchers watched, waiting to see if his pride would doom him the way it had nearly destroyed Harlan. Finally, Thornton removed his hat and looked directly at Beatrice. "Yes, ma'am, I can do that." Word spread quickly. Within weeks, ranchers from across the territory were visiting the Mackenzie Hartwell property, as it was now called, to learn about the irrigation systems and drought-resistant grasses. Beatrice held informal classes, teaching the techniques while Harlan demonstrated the physical work. James handled the financial aspects, selling seeds and surplus grass to neighbors. The transformation was remarkable. By late fall, the property had lush green pastures where there had been only dust and dead grass. The cattle herd, supplemented by new purchases made possible by selling grass and seeds, was healthy and growing. The property that had been worth nothing 4 months earlier was now the most valuable ranch in the territory. But the real transformation was in Harlan himself. Working alongside Beatrice day after day, he'd been forced to confront every assumption he'd held about gender, capability, and worth. He'd watched her solve problems he couldn't, make decisions he wouldn't have thought of, and work with a dedication that humbled him. Most importantly, he'd learned that accepting help and acknowledging another person's superiority in certain areas didn't diminish his own worth. It enhanced it. One evening in October, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset over green pastures, Harlan said quietly, "You saved my life, Beatrice. Not just my ranch, my life. I was a bitter, prideful man headed for a dark end. You showed me another way." Beatrice smiled. "You saved yourself, Harlan. I just offered you the tools. You had to choose to use them." "The partnership," Harlan said, "it's been more successful than I imagined. But I want to propose something. James owns 40%, you own 40%, I own 20%. That's not equitable. The knowledge and resources came from you. I want to transfer half my share to you, making you the majority owner." Beatrice shook her head firmly. "No, the partnership works because we're balanced. You contribute your knowledge of this land, knowledge I don't have. James contributes his energy and his ability to connect with the younger generation. I contribute the agricultural techniques. We need each other equally. That's what makes this work." James, who'd been listening from inside the house, came out to join them. "Mrs. Hartwell's right, Father. This isn't about who owns more, it's about what we build together." As winter approached, the Mackenzie Hartwell Ranch had become the center of an agricultural revolution in the territory. The techniques Beatrice had introduced spread to dozens of properties, saving ranches from bankruptcy and keeping families fed through the winter. The bank, recognizing the value of supporting innovative farming, provided loans to other ranchers to implement similar systems. Marcus Thornton, true to his word, publicly credited Beatrice at a territorial meeting, saying, "Mrs. Beatrice Hartwell taught me that capability has nothing to do with gender and everything to do with knowledge and will. She saved my ranch, and I suspect she's saved this entire region." The acknowledgment cost him his pride but saved his respect and his livelihood. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came in early December, when a new rancher arrived in the territory, bought property adjacent to Thornton's land, and immediately sought out Beatrice for advice. The man, freshly arrived from Boston, had no preconceptions about women in agriculture. To him, Beatrice was simply the expert everyone recommended. "It's changing," James observed, watching the interaction. "Slowly, but it's changing." "Not fast enough," Beatrice replied, "but yes, it's changing. And maybe that's what we accomplished here, not just saving one ranch, but showing people a different way forward." That evening, the three partners sat down to review their finances. The ranch had earned enough to not only maintain operations through winter, but also to provide each of them with a modest income. More importantly, they'd established a sustainable system that would continue generating revenue for years to come. "To partnerships," James said, raising a glass of cider. "To knowledge," Beatrice added. "To humility," Harlan finished, his voice thick with emotion, "and to the woman who taught an old fool that wisdom has no gender." They drank together, three unlikely partners who'd found success by setting aside prejudice and embracing collaboration. As winter settled over the Missouri grasslands, the Mackenzie Hartwell Ranch stood green and prosperous, a testament to what could be achieved when pride gave way to partnership, when knowledge overcame prejudice, and when desperation forced people to see beyond their own limitations. Harlan, who'd stood at his lowest point just months earlier, ready to lose everything, now looked toward spring with genuine optimism. He'd learned that accepting help wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. He'd learned that his assumptions about capability and worth had been narrow and wrong. Most importantly, he'd learned that redemption wasn't about restoring what was lost, but about building something new and better from the ruins of the old. The story of the Mackenzie Hartwell Ranch spread beyond the territory, attracting attention from agricultural societies and even government officials interested in drought mitigation. Beatrice found herself corresponding with universities and writing articles for farming journals, sharing the techniques that had saved not just one ranch, but an entire region. Years later, when Harlan Mackenzie finally passed away at the age of 68, he died on land that was thriving and prosperous, surrounded by a community that respected him not for his stubbornness, but for his ability to change. His final words to James were simple: "Take care of our partner. She saved us all." The ranch continued to operate successfully under Beatrice and James's management, becoming a model for sustainable agriculture in difficult climates. The partnership that had begun in desperation evolved into a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. And every spring, when they planted new grasses and tended the irrigation systems, they remembered the dawn when everything changed, when a proud man's world crumbled and a determined woman offered not charity, but opportunity. The dawn when one thing, knowledge, shared freely and without condition, saved everything.